Greetings, I'm Zachary Hepner. Pleased to share this Dvar Torah with you for Parashat Vayera. The character trait of rachamim, compassion, is an important trait. It's one of the 13 attributes of God, which we are obligated to emulate. Kel, Rachum, v'chanun. And imitating God and His traits is an obligatory commandment. Chazal state in Shabbat 151b, Kol hamerachem al habriot rachamim alav min hashamayim. Heaven is compassionate to whomever exercises their compassion on others. Compassion is not only a good trait, Chazal even see it as a marker of spiritual, genetic connection to Avraham Avinu. As it says in Yevamot 79, Shlosha simanim yesh b'umazo rachamanim ba'ishanim v'gomlei chasadim. Whomever possesses rachamim, shame, and gemilut chasadim, or charitable magnanimity, must be a descendant of Avraham. And the converse is that whomever does not possess these traits is not from Avraham's seed. This is not only homiletic, it's even codified as a form of circumstantial evidence. The midah of rachamim sounds axiomatic, however, it's not. The Torah clearly considers it a trait that should not always be exercised. One explicit example is with the idolatrous missionary, the Mesi Dumediach, where the Torah says, Lo tachmol v'lo techaser alav, do not hide or have compassion on him. The Torah prohibits finding a legal loophole in defense of an idolatrous missionary to spare his life, indicating that one's zealous love of Hashem must be a countermeasure that's sometimes exercised against the midah of rachamim. In other words, rachamim is of weighted importance, but it's not axiomatic. Chazal have strong misgivings about misguided compassion. Kohelet Rabbah 7:16. Amar Rabbi Elazar, Kol hamerachem al ha'achzarim, sofo lihitachzer al harachmanim. Shaul richem al agag val meitav hatzon v'habakar, v'sofo shenitachzar al nov ir hakohanim. On the verse, don't be an excessive tzaddik in Kohelet Rabbah, Rabbi Elazar says, whomever has compassion on the cruel will end up making themselves cruel on those who deserve compassion, citing King Saul's compassion on King Agag and King Saul's subsequent cruelty against the entire city of Nov Ir HaKohanim, which was tragic. Saul's misguided compassion and subsequent cruelty are cited frequently in Chazal, including Yalkut Shimoni, the Tanchuma, Parashat Masechet Yoma, Masechet Megillah. It's the example par excellence, demonstrating the dangers of misguided rachamim. That's King Shaul. Shaul's compassion was his Achilles heel. Or as Chazal say in Yerushalmi Sanhedrin 2:3, Kol shehu rachman al ha'achzarim, sofo shena'aseh achzar al harachmanim. Whoever has rachamim on the achzarim will end up becoming cruel to the rachmanim. Chazal cite 4 cataclysmic events in biblical history: the flood, the Tower of Babel, the destruction of Sodom, and the Pilegesh Begiva story at the end of the book of Judges. The flood and Babel narratives were of global importance. However, Sodom and the Pilegesh Begiva stories were related more locally to the history of Avraham and the Israelites. The Pilegesh Begiva story took place over 600 years after the Sodom story. I think the notion of Abraham's rachamim, the destruction of Sodom, the Pilegesh Begiva, and the misguided rachamim of King Saul are in fact connected thematically. The rachamim of Avraham is self-evident. Avraham did not advocate for the people of Sodom who were evil, but rather for the misguided justice of the innocent people of Sodom not to experience collateral damage in the destruction of Sodom. Avraham was beseeching for God to give rachamim to protect the innocent. That was the purpose. The people of Sodom themselves were the antithesis of rachamim, as cited explicitly in the Midrash Tanchuma, Vayera. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Asu bate dinim lifnei elilehem, kadei shitbarech shamam al ha'avla, v'hayu kofrim b'tova u'marvirin midat rachamim. Rabbi Yehuda says the people of Sodom built their own courts of law in front of their idols so that their gods' names would be invoked over acts of injustice. They denied goodness and compassion, and they abolished the attribute of rachamim from among them. The wickedness of the inhabitants of Sodom were both de facto, in the sense that they exhibited wickedness, but the egregious nature of their sinfulness was not their de facto wickedness, but their institutionalized wickedness de jure, making cruelty the law, and therefore the only defense of sinful inhabitants would be to claim the Nuremberg defense, the Nazi defense following the Shoah, that they never broke the law because they were following the law. This legal positivism defense for committing murder in Nuremberg, or in the case of Sodom, for their institutionalized de jure cruelty, may or may not be a defense in Nuremberg, but it was bad enough for God to take action. Parenthetically, look at the rabbi's views of the sins of the Dor HaMabul and the Dor HaFlaga, the flood and the Tower of Babel, and the people of Sodom. The straw that broke the camel's back and brought the Almighty from heaven down to intercede was not any particular action by an evil person, but the de jure normalization of evil, which makes the entire society complicit. Chazal described the Dor HaMabul as using legal loopholes as a mean of Hamas, which is corruption or theft. Similarly, in the Dor HaFlaga, they were unified in their social experiment against the divine fiat to spread across the lands. And similarly with the people of Sodom, as Chazal say, this is a Tosefta in Sanhedrin, Anshe Sodom lo nidonu ela al shehayu mashchitim darchei enosh al haaretz. This is their sexual crimes. The inhabitants of Sodom were only judged because they changed the sexual norms. Or in their corruption of justice, which is in Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer 25. Hayu shoftei Sodom notlim shem la'atzmam, shofet hasheker, shofet hakezev, shofet hashaker, shofet hamidma imba ani levakesh pat lechem, kol echad noten lo dinar ve'ein noten lo le'echol, v'chi hayamet ba kol echad v'notel dinaro. The judges of Sodom would take for themselves names: the judge of falsehood, the judge of deception, the fraudulent judge, the judge of mockery. If a poor came and asking for a piece of bread, each one of them would give him a coin, yet no one would sell him any food. When the poor man died of hunger, each would come and reclaim his coin. This theme of how bad the judges are is itself a theme that the buck stops with the judges. And if there's corruption in the Supreme Court, then corruption has reached the highest echelons of society. No one can claim that the corruption is de facto, but it is by definition de jure. Secondly, the egregious level of judicious corruption and the requirement to have fair and just courts are not only cited in the Ten Commandments, but they're referred to countless times in the Nevi'im, in the prophets, Yirmiyahu and Yeshayahu and others. There are too many instances in the Nevi'im to count. The connection to the misguided compassion of King Shaul and Sodom might seem far-fetched, but in fact it is linked, and here it is. The narrative of the destruction of Sodom is clearly linked to the tragic events within the Pilegesh Begiva, when the pregnant concubine was group raped and then left to die. The intertextual connections are numerous. Making such connections is far from novel. Chazal saw the connections, scholars see the connections, everybody sees the linkage, the gratuity of the host, the insistence of the mob, the offering of two women to the mob, the collapse of society by divine and human hand. As Chazal, in fact, say explicitly, this is Parashat Rabbah 50, Amar Rabbi Levi, Kol ma'asem shel Avraham levanav, u'ma'asem shel Lot livnei Lot, Lot amar hineh li shtei vanot, v'hanoten pilaksho begiva asakein. Rabbi Levi says the deed of the fathers is a sign for the children. That's Maaseh Avot Siman Labanim. Just as Lot said, "Behold, I have two daughters," so too the man in Pilegesh Begiva story gave his concubine to this mob. The parallel aftermath is in fact less well known. This is the connection. Just as Lot had inappropriate relations with his daughter, the decimated tribe of Binyamin inappropriately engaged in extra-tribal intra-marriage for their wives. The cruel response of the 11 tribes of Israel against the cruel tribe of Binyamin is a precursor for the most compassionate and unassuming member of the tribe of Binyamin to become the king over Israel. That's Shaul HaMelech. Shaul's triumph as king was cathartic against the cruelty of Binyamin and the cruel reaction of the 11 tribes against Binyamin. In this context, Chazal urge against being compassionate to those who are cruel. King Agag was either a cruel person and a cruel king who deserved no compassion, or he was from the tribe of Amalek, who are ontologically a cruel nation who deserved no compassion. Shaul HaMelech's misguided compassion against King Agag was Shaul HaMelech's Achilles' heel, and he ended up being cruel to the entire city of Nov Ir HaKohanim, which is a tragedy in its own right. Now, just to stay on track, we started with Abraham's demand for mercy, using justice as his tool. Abraham is demanding de jure compassion on the city of Sodom because righteous citizens should not be destroyed because of their wicked neighbors. God does not heed Abraham's petition because there are insufficient righteous citizens in Sodom. The wickedness of Sodom is not only de facto, but institutionalized de jure wickedness, which echoes the institutionalized wickedness of the Dor HaMabul and the institutionalized wickedness of the Dor HaHaflaga, the flood and the Tower of Babel generations. The wickedness of Sodom echo the wicked narrative of the concubine Pilegesh Begiva narrative. The story of the Pilegesh Begiva is the prelude to the rise of King Shaul, who is the example par excellence of what happens when one is merciful to those who are cruel and ends up becoming cruel to those who are merciful or deserve mercy. Now, the takeaway is the Gemara in Yevamot 79. Whoever has the characteristics of rachamim is probably from the seed of Avraham. God had already sung Abraham's praises just a few verses earlier. Ki dativ laman asher tzavet banav beito acharav v'shamru derech Adonai lasot tzedakah u'mishpat laman havi Adonai al Abraham et asher diber alav. For I have singled him out, that's Avraham, that he may instruct his children and his posterity to keep the way of Hashem by doing tzedakah u'mishpat, in order that Hashem may bring about for Avraham what he had promised him. God had singled Avraham out because he would instruct his children and posterity to follow the ways of Hashem. What's that? Tzedakah u'mishpat. That is exactly what Abraham had attempted to do. He was exercising his midat rachamim, his characteristic of compassion, but legally, with legal jargon, to force the Almighty to execute righteousness to those who could legally be deserving of justice. In other words, he was pursuing justice using the justice system. Abraham was not advocating for extrajudicial justice. He was petitioning for judicial mercy. Not only that, but Abraham would teach his children and posterity to emulate those traits. Such an exercise of rachamim is itself, when administered properly, always directed to those who are rachmanim and not to those who are achzarim, thereby never at risk of the pitfalls of Shaul HaMelech, who exercised judicial mercy when King Agag deserved anything but mercy. Wishing you all a Shabbat Shalom.